Welcome to How to Become a Production SQL Database Administrator. My name is Raphael. In the previous several videos, we looked at one of the HA solutions called log shippings. We now continue with the concept of HA solutions, and now we look at the concept called, or technology called, database mirroring. This is the next level of protection that we have against HA solutions. And log shipping obviously is an older model of database mirroring. And this is the earliest version, I believe, with 2005 or 8 onwards. So this is what we're going to be discussing. Now, one thing to note is that even though I'm going to be discussing, giving you several videos on database mirroring, and we're going to be going over through the process of what it is and how to set it up and so on, and what is the purpose, database mirroring also has become what's called deprecated, which means it will no longer be supported by Microsoft SQL in the future editions. You will still have it. It still exists in 2016. But when we talk about not being supported or deprecated, what we're actually talking about is Microsoft itself not supporting it. That doesn't mean that the technology won't exist in future versions. But this technology has been replaced with what's called always-on solutions, which I'll be talking next. So I'll be talking about you briefly on this and showing you at least what database mirroring is, so you have a concept of understanding of that. So let's continue. So what is database mirroring? Well, database mirroring is the process of having a redundant copy of a single database at another location. Remember, the whole premise and idea of HA solutions, high availability solutions, is that you have redundant copies scattered throughout your enterprise. Now, they can be obviously within separate servers, separate cities, or separate offices, or separate locations as in separate states, or even in separate countries. So this is the whole idea, is you do not want to have all your eggs in one basket, so to speak. We want to have redundant copies of databases that are deemed critical in several different locations in case of disaster recovery, which is DR solutions. So this is the whole idea of database mirroring, very similar to log shipping and very dissimilar to log shipping. And I'll be going over the comparison in a few minutes. So database mirroring is the process of having a copy of a single database to another location to ensure continuous data availability in case of a disaster on the principal database. Now, you'll hear me start talking about the primary server or the source database called principal, and then the destination database or the server called the mirror. So these are the terminologies now, principal and mirror, when we're talking about database mirroring. So database mirroring ensures that one viable copy of database will always remain accessible during disaster recovery or downtime if it's needed on the principal server or the primary server. So here's the terminology that we've been talking about. The principal server is the source server, and the mirror is the destination server. So just taking note of those. There are two types of operation modes when we're talking about database mirroring. And obviously, when we actually look at the database mirroring, you'll get a better understanding. That's called synchronous operation mode and asynchronous operation mode. I'm just going to briefly go over it here, then I'll explain in a little detail what we're talking about and demonstrating database mirroring. So what we're talking about, synchronous operation mode, this is used when very real-time accuracy is required, which means that the system must immediately copy every change in the principal database, and then also make sure that the mirror has the exact data, copy of data at the time of the operation. So this is referred to as what we call a hot standby. Now, obviously, if you don't have this immediate synchronization of virtually 100%, then it's called a warm standby, and that's asynchronous mode. So synchronous mode operation is having two sets, having a single set of database, and they're virtually 100% synced with each other. So if case the primary database goes down, the secondary database virtually, or the mirror database, I should say, very rarely loses data. It's virtually synchronized. Asynchronous operation mode obviously is used in the context not fully synchronized. So you have where the principal database the principal database has updates and inserts and so on the database, but it's not fully synchronized to the database yet. And it's not fully synchronized, therefore, you may have some data loss in the process if a failover occurs, or you need to do or you need to manage some kind of a disaster. And this obviously is referred to as a warm standby as opposed to a hot standby. And again, this will become a little more clear when I discuss it in detail. So what are some of the advantages of having a database mirror or having that technology? Well, it's relatively easy to set up, so that's a good thing, very similar to log shipping. Database mirroring is an automatic failover process, and I'll be discussing that deeply. What that means is that whereas log shipping, and when we talk about the comparison, this will become clearer also. Whereas with log shipping, if you had the primary database go down and you needed the secondary database to come up, you have to manually change that transition. Here, you can do it automatically with what's called a witness, which is a third instance of a SQL server. All applications connections can be redirected automatically with proper configuration. So if you do have what's called a third server, that actually does the migration from the principal to the destination. And I'll show you that also in a second. There is no data, there will be no data transfer latency in synchronous mode. And again, what I mean by that is that it's very little data loss and very little time loss when you have it in synchronous mode. So what are some of the disadvantages of having database mirroring? Well, one of the clear disadvantages is that you can only have one-to-one relationship with a principal and mirror. And what that means is that if you have one server here and you have a server here and you want to do database mirroring, you can only have one-to-one. Whereas with log shipping, if you had the primary server here and you wanted to log ship, you could have multiple servers here, and we'll show you that in a second when I go over to the PowerPoint. Cannot be used for reporting solutions. It's always in recovering or restoring state. It's inaccessible. Now you can do what's called take a snapshot and do reporting, but generally you'll see when we talk about database mirroring, it's in a restoring state and it's inaccessible. Mirror only supports full recovery and not bulk or simple, whereas LogShipped did bulk and full recovery. And that's it. So now you have a kind of a understanding of what database mirroring is. Let's graphically look at all this so we have a better understanding of it and the terminology. So let me go here. So database mirroring uses endpoints to sync data across the network. So what does that mean? So if you look at it here is your principal server, and this one is going to be very similar to the diagram that we'll be looking at log shipping. Here we have what's now called the principal server. So let's imagine we have a server in Los Angeles and it's called the principal server. Here in New York, we have the second database or server called a mirror. So here we call it principal, here we call it mirror. The way they communicate with each other after we've done a full database backup and a transactional log backup, and to make sure that this data that's been updated here or whatever has been happening to this database syncs with database is through TCP/IP communication and called endpoints. And I'll be showing you that in a second. So that's important to know. So when we're setting it up, database mirroring, the first thing we do, just like we did in log shipping, is we take a full database backup and a transactional log backup, and we dump it into a shared directory, just like we did for log shipping. And then we restore that full database backup and transactional log backup to the mirror server, and you only do this once. And once that is done, this thing's over. We create what's called endpoints, which are communications between the principal server and the mirror server, and they keep in communication with each other. And anytime this data changes here or whatever occurring is here, is automatically being updated here, depending on the operation mode, which I'll speak to you in a minute when we see it, whether it's synchronous or asynchronous. Synchronous just means this. Synchronous means if I make an update here, that update or insert or whatever the modification I make to the database here is going to go to the mirror and say, hey, update this. And as soon as this update is here, it'll ping back. And then once the communication occurs between both servers, then the transaction is committed and it goes back to the application server and says, hey, I've done the update or insert or whatever the modification here. So in synchronous mode, both servers have to be in sync before it sends a signal back to the application mode. In asynchronous mode, only this is updated and it goes back to the application, says, hey, I've done it, and then it will go back and update the mirror version. So that's what we talk about latency and data loss here. So that's another reason why it's good to have it. But again, you'll notice when I explain to you, there's a disadvantage and advantage of having asynchronous and synchronous. There's always some give and take. So let's look at what we'll be covering here in the next several videos. We're going to be talking about what database mirroring is, as I have. We've been talking about the disadvantage and advantages of database mirroring. I'm going to now give you an example, so a comparison between database mirroring and log shipping. We're going to talk about when to select the appropriate technology, whether you should choose database mirroring or log shipping. We're going to give you a demo of using the GUI demo of creating how to create a database mirror on a single machine. And then I'm going to use repeat the whole process using T-SQL on a single machine. And then I'm going to also give you how to monitor database mirroring once we've set it up, both through using the GUI and the T-SQL scripts. And then obviously database mirroring to be deprecated, as I mentioned, is going to be replaced with always on availability groups. So these are the kind of steps that we're going to be taking in the next couple of videos, and we're going to be looking at these advantages. So let me just quickly go back to this one so we have a good understanding of what database mirroring is. So let me go here actually. So just to repeat now, this will become a little more clear of what it is. So what is database mirroring? Database mirroring is the process of taking a principal server database, taking a full database and backup, putting it into a shared drive that's accessible by both servers, and then the mirror server restores that full and transactional log database backup. And then once all the processes are occurring here, or whatever the modifications are here, these are directly communicated to the mirror server via TCP/IP communication, which stands for I believe transmissional control protocols and what's called endpoints. So it takes all this. Now let's look at a comparison between log shipping and database mirroring also. So let me go to my Excel sheet, which I'll provide you. So here you'll see a comparison. So here you have log shipping, and here you have database mirroring. So let's look at the differences and commonalities. In log shipping, it automatically sends transactional log backups from one database to another. In database mirroring, you have two copies of a single database on different servers for SQL Engine. Now this is the important part that distinguishes log shipping versus database mirroring, and that is, you notice that when we set up log shipping, we took transactional log backups and transferred them to secondary server. In the database mirroring, we actually take the individual transactional log records and transfer them using TCP/IP endpoints. So this is why you can get 100% on asynchronous mode, because you're actually sending the actual records, whereas this was controlled by every 15 minutes, which is the default settings for the backup, copy, and restore. This is done on a live basis. So whatever happens in a database, principal database, if you have it in synchronous mode, is occurring immediately on the mirror database. So that's why you can get 100% in a synchronous mode. It can be configured one-to-many. We mentioned that in log shipping, you can have one one primary server and many secondary servers. But in a database, you can only have one-to-one relationship. If I want to do database mirroring on AdventureWorks database, then I can only do one-to-one. I can't implement database mirroring on an Adventure Databricks database here, and then have the same thing going on another server. It's only one-to-one relationship. So that's a disadvantage there. This requires, as we mentioned, a manual failover. This requires a manual failover or automatic, and automatic only if you have what's called a witness server. Now, I personally don't like having witness servers. on a production environment because I want to control what's happening and I want to be manually fail over it, but it depends on the environment. You can use a secondary server for reporting. So this, when you're having log shipping, remember if you had it in the standby mode, it is accessible. So you could use it for reporting if you wish. Here, obviously, it is not because it's in what's called a constant recovery mode. Supports bulk log and full recovery. This one only full, so you make sure you take a note of that. The restore can be completed using a no recovery or standby options. And here we can only do it in no recovery. So this is what I mean by it's inaccessible here. Can we log ship to other servers? You can. As I said, you can log ship from one to many, but in this case, it's only it's only one-to-one relationship, but you can have about 10 databases separately database mirrored to separate servers. And generally, they advocate 10, the maximum. There is some latency here in data transfer, but again, there'll be no transfer latency if you have synchronous mode. Both committed and uncommitted transactions are transferred to the secondary database, and only committed transactions are transferred to the mirror. And that's why you have 100% configuration, because if you have a break between the system, then the non-committed will be rolled back. This provides a warm standby solution for multiple copies of the database. And this one is obviously one-to-one, and database session is synchronized. Provides a hot standby, as we mentioned. And obviously, depending on the mode, you can either have some data loss or you can't have some data loss. Let me look at the time here. So we're almost there. So this particular video, I just want to explain what database mirroring is, what is the difference between log shipping and database mirroring. And obviously, this is a higher technology, if you will, than log shipping, the next version of it. Then the next version of database mirroring, obviously, the next step, the next evolution of HA solution is the always-on solution, and that's a great one that we'll be emphasizing. Now, in this particular example, I'm going to be showing you how to do database mirroring on a single machine, meaning I'm going to be using a local machine, local SQL, rather than using the domain. And the reason is because I've had several students, about half a dozen students, ask me several questions, and those questions were: one, can you do database mirroring on a single machine rather than two separate machines? And the answer is yes. And all you have to do is install SQL Server on one machine, then reinstall SQL Server again, so you have two instances within a single box. And that's what I'm going to demonstrate to you here using this principle. And the reason I'm doing that, and the reason I'm using that, is because I want to illustrate to those individuals how you can set up database mirroring on a single machine, and it's a lot easier to do that. So I want you to be comfortable with the principle of it, rather than doing on a domain environment, because that requires a little more detail in terms of security. But once you get the concept of this, it's relatively straightforward also. So I think I'm going to leave it here and continue. So I'm almost time's up. I don't want to keep it beyond 20 minutes. So just to reiterate what database mirroring is, the advantages, disadvantages, and the comparison between log shipping. And in the next video, I'm actually going to start database mirroring, and I'll show you how to set up on a single machine. So I'll just leave it there and we'll continue. So my name is Rafael, and this is how to become a production SQL database administrator. See you in the next video.